For 9 years, the pile sat there. And for 9 years, no one stopped to look.
She had come back with numbers. With a plan no one in Hardin County had asked for. Everything she needed was already written down. The question was whether anyone would believe it.
He had given her half of what she asked for, and told himself that was enough.
On a morning in March of 1885, Willa Crestwood stood at the edge of her family's back pasture in Hardin County, Ohio, and looked at 9 years of other people's problems stacked 12 feet high. The hickory logs had been coming since 1876. Crooked ones, forked ones, logs with too much sweep to run clean through a production mill, logs with burrows and figure that gummed up automated blades and threw off the tolerances that commercial sawyers needed to stay profitable. The Crestwood farm sat 3 miles east of the largest sawmill operation in Kenton, which had been processing hardwood for the regional furniture and building trade since the late 1860s. Somewhere along the way, the mill's original yard manager, a man named Elias Pruett, father of the current manager, had worked out an arrangement with Willa's father, Garland Crestwood, that suited both parties well enough. The mill would dump its reject hickory on the back corner of the Crestwood property, rather than pay to haul it to the county disposal yard. Garland would keep what he could burn for winter heat and let the rest accumulate. Nobody made money, nobody lost money. The logs just piled. By the spring of 1885, there were somewhere between 400 and 500 individual logs in that pile. Depending on how you counted the ones that had split along natural checks during the freeze-thaw cycles of 9 Ohio winters. Some were 8 feet long, some were 4. Some were twisted so severely along their grain that a professional sawyer, walking past, would have shaken his head without breaking stride. The pile had become a feature of that stretch of county road the way a collapsed fence or a dead elm becomes a feature. Something neighbors registered without processing because it had occupied the same ground long enough to stop being surprising. Willa Crestwood was 23 years old that March. She had driven home from Columbus 2 weeks earlier with a degree from Ohio Agricultural and Mechanical College and a minor in applied materials science that nobody in Hardin County had asked for or particularly understood. She stood at the edge of the pasture for a long time that morning, long enough for the March wind to work through the barn jacket she'd worn since high school. She was not looking at the pile the way you look at a problem. She was looking at it the way you look at something you have been turning over in your mind for 2 years, waiting until the moment you could stand in front of it and verify that your thinking was right. Her thinking was right. She had known it would be. To understand what Willa saw when she looked at that pile, you need to understand something about hickory, something about the decade she had just lived through, and something about a woman named Cordelia Vane, who stood in front of a classroom in the fall of 1883 and said things that most of her colleagues in the Ohio A&M faculty would not have said. Partly because they had not thought them through, and partly because thinking them through required caring about questions that the institution had not yet decided were worth caring about. Hickory is the hardest, toughest domestic hardwood on the North American continent. Its particular combination of density and shock resistance, the quality woodworkers call its ability to absorb impact without fracturing, has no match among native species. White ash comes closest, and ash had been the traditional wood for tool handles across America since before the Revolution, prized for its straight grain and its willingness to bend, rather than break under repeated stress. But the ash forests of the Midwest had been worked hard for 2 generations by 1885, and the easy timber was gone. What remained required longer hauls, more selective cutting, higher processing costs. The premium handle market, axes, hatchets, hammers, mauls, draw knives, timber chisels, the tools that built the American interior, was quietly looking for alternatives that most producers had not yet organized around. Hickory was the answer. It had always been the answer. The problem was that hickory was difficult. It dulled cutting blades faster than oak or maple. It dried unevenly without careful management, developing surface hardening that made blanks brittle before the interior moisture had equalized. It required slower feed rates through automated equipment, which meant reduced throughput, which meant reduced revenue per operating hour for any mill running on volume margins. For a commercial sawmill like the one 3 miles west of the Crestwood farm, hickory logs, particularly the crooked, rejected, unsellable ones, were a disposal problem, not a resource. That distinction between disposal problem and resource was the thing Willa had been carrying in her mind since October of 1883. She had come to Ohio A&M in the fall of 1881, one of 11 women admitted to the college's agricultural science program in a year when the faculty had not entirely agreed on whether admitting women to that program was a good idea. The debate, conducted largely in hallways and faculty meeting minutes, rather than to anyone's face, had produced a compromise that satisfied no one. Women could enroll, could complete coursework, could receive degrees, but would be excluded from certain field practicums deemed physically unsuitable. Willa had found this arrangement irritating in the specific way that arbitrary barriers are irritating. Not devastating, just a persistent friction requiring workarounds, and had spent her first year identifying which faculty enforced the restrictions and which ones didn't notice or didn't care. Professor Cordelia Vane did not notice and did not care, which was one of several reasons Willa had sought out her courses. Professor Vane taught applied materials science with the focused intensity of someone who had spent 2 decades proving that her field of study was worth taking seriously and had run out of patience for people who disagreed. She was 45, plain-spoken, wore practical dark clothing, and had been passed over for the position of department chair twice in 7 years. Once with a polite explanation about institutional fit, once with no explanation at all, which told you everything the first explanation had left out. She taught as though she had nothing left to lose by being direct, which in Willa's experience was the rarest and most valuable quality in any teacher. In October of 1883, Professor Vane devoted one full session of her upper division materials seminar to the American hand tool handle industry. 200 years of history compressed into 90 minutes. The industry had been built on domestic hardwood, first ash, then hickory where ash was unavailable, both species chosen for their shock resistance and their abundance across the eastern and midwestern forests. The tools themselves were indispensable infrastructure. Every farm, every construction site, every workshop in the country required them, and the handles wore out and required replacement at rates that made the market both large and reliably recurring. The problem the industry was facing in 1883, Professor Vane said, was a supply problem masquerading as a cost problem. Ash timber was becoming genuinely scarce in significant portions of Ohio and Indiana due to a combination of overcutting and the natural maturation cycles of second-growth forest. The large mills in Cincinnati and Philadelphia that had historically supplied premium ash handles were finding their raw material costs climbing and their yields declining. Some had already begun sourcing from Tennessee and Arkansas, adding transportation costs. Others were experimenting with composite materials, pressed fiber, laminated wood products, that were cheaper to process but performed noticeably worse under the stress of actual use. She drew 2 sets of numbers on the blackboard in her careful angular hand. The first set, retail prices for premium American-made handles in current 1883 market conditions. Full-length axe handle, $2.80 to $4.50 at quality hardware stores and agricultural suppliers. A hatchet handle, $1.40 to $2.20. A hammer handle, 90 cents to $1.60. These were not the prices of cheap commodity replacement handles sold at general stores. These were the prices of handles made by small producers who controlled their material quality and sold to buyers who understood what they were paying for. The second set, the cost of raw material required to produce a single premium handle blank from hickory timber that a production mill had already rejected as unsuitable for slab stock. Professor Vane had worked through the calculations herself, corresponding with 2 small handle makers in Kentucky and western Pennsylvania, who had agreed to share their numbers. The cost, 12 to 18 cents per blank, depending on log quality and yield rate. The gap between those 2 sets of numbers, she said, was where a small producer could build a viable business. Not a large business. Not a business that would compete with the Cincinnati mills on volume. A business that competed on material quality, on the ability to source and process species that production mills found inconvenient, on direct relationships with buyers who cared about what they were getting. The market for that kind of business was real, underserved, growing as premium buyers found the large mills increasingly unable to deliver consistent quality, and it required, as its primary input, access to hickory logs that commercial operations had already written off. Willa wrote that down. She underlined it twice. She sat with it through the rest of the session, and through dinner that evening and through the following morning, which she spent not in her scheduled surveying practicum, but in the college library, pulling every reference she could find on domestic hardwood markets, handle manufacturing methods, and hickory drying protocols. What she was thinking about the entire time was the pile of logs on the back corner of her family's farm in Hardin County. She spent the next 2 years building the notebook. Not metaphorically, physically filling it, page by page with the information she would need to turn what she had seen in Professor Vane's classroom into something that could be tested against reality. She priced premium handles at 14 different hardware stores and agricultural suppliers in Columbus, Findlay, and Toledo, visiting each one on Saturdays when she could borrow a horse from the college's livery. She corresponded with 3 small handle makers, 2 in Kentucky, 1 in western Pennsylvania, asking questions they were sometimes willing to answer and sometimes not, learning something useful from both the answers and the silences. She read every forestry extension publication she could locate on hickory drying, which were not many, but were specific enough to teach her what she didn't know. She drew diagrams of a drying kiln she could build herself from available materials. She made lists of equipment, researched used prices at estate sales and mill auctions listed in the Ohio Farmer, and built cost estimates from the ground up rather than from the top down. By the spring of 1885, the notebook was full. The cover had warped slightly from 2 years of being carried in a jacket pocket through Ohio winters. The pages were dense with her handwriting, not the careful penmanship she used for college examinations, but the compressed, abbreviation-heavy script of someone writing faster than the thoughts were arriving, trying not to lose anything. She had written near the back, in the margin of a page otherwise devoted to yield calculations. Everything that needs to be true for this to work is true. The question is whether it can be proven to people who haven't done the arithmetic. She had not yet shown that sentence to anyone. Garland Crestwood had farmed the same 480 acres of Hardin County, corn and soybeans for 30 years with a kind of quiet competence that generates no stories because nothing goes wrong. He was 61, methodical in the way that men who have absorbed their father's lessons very deeply become methodical, not rigid, but deeply grooved, his daily patterns worn into the farm's routines the way feet wear into a barn floor until the floor shows the shape of where you've walked every morning for decades. He had taken over the farm from his father Cyrus in 1861, a terrible year to inherit anything in Ohio, and had managed it through the war and through the agricultural collapse of 1873, which had taken 2 of his neighbors' farms and left a third barely standing. Cyrus had survived 1873 by doing exactly what his own father had done: corn, soybeans, the elevator in town, the operating loan from the bank in Kenton, the same rotation on the same acres year after year. Not because those choices were inspired, but because they were legible. The elevator understood them. The bank understood them. When you walked in with 30 years of consistent yield records behind you, the conversation was straightforward. You grew what you'd always grown, and the system that had grown up around what you'd always grown processed it without friction. Garland had watched what happened to the men who tried to step outside that system. The man 2 townships south who planted Milo in 1871 because a traveling buyer had promised premium prices, the buyer didn't come back. The 2 brothers who tried merino sheep in 1878 because wool prices looked favorable, wool prices changed. The tobacco venture in 1881 that 3 families in the south part of the county had gone into together, pooling resources on equipment and shared curing infrastructure. The market shifted. The equipment debt remained. These were not foolish men. They were men who had looked at an opportunity and calculated incorrectly, or calculated correctly, but encountered circumstances their calculations hadn't accounted for. Garland Crestwood did not take risks. He had watched what risk did to people he cared about. The corn and soybean operation ran on roughly 480 acres, about 380 of which were owned outright, with the remainder cash rented from 2 neighbors who had moved to town after their children left farming. Average corn yield on his ground ran around 175 bushels per acre in good years, closer to 150 in dry ones. Soybeans ran 50 to 53 bushels per acre, depending on rotation. The margins were not generous. They had not been generous in 30 years. The conventional wisdom at the elevator, at the Grange meetings, at every kitchen table in Hardin County, was that you manage thin margins by farming more acres or by managing costs more precisely, not by experimenting with something the system didn't know how to process. He was not a man who questioned what he did. That was not stubbornness, exactly. It was more like the deep groove in the barn floor. The groove is not a choice. It is simply where your feet go. Bess Crestwood was 58, practical in the way that women who have kept financial records for 3 decades become practical. She understood the farm's numbers better than Garland did, which both of them knew, and neither of them said out loud. She read the accounts every Saturday evening at the kitchen table, made notes in the margin, and filed them in the cedar box under the stairs she'd been using for that purpose since 1859. She observed more than she spoke. When she did speak, it was usually because she had been considering what to say for longer than anyone realized. Edmund Crestwood, Willa's younger brother, had turned 18 the previous December. He was not particularly interested in farming, not particularly interested in woodworking, not particularly interested in anything yet. In the specific, provisional way of 18-year-olds who have not yet encountered the thing that will organize their interest. He was patient, careful with his hands, and willing to work for fair compensation, which put him ahead of a significant portion of the available labor in Hardin County. Willa came home in June of 1885. She spent 2 weeks walking the property, reassessing the log pile with the knowledge she'd spent 2 years accumulating. She noted which logs had sections of straight grain sufficient to yield full-length axe handle blanks, which had shorter usable sections, better suited to hatchet and hammer handles, and which had the dense, irregular figure that, properly worked, produced handles of unusual beauty for buyers who cared about both the function and the appearance of what they used. She updated her yield estimates. She revised her equipment costs based on what was currently available at estate sales in Findlay and what she had seen advertised in the Ohio Farmer. Then she sat down at the kitchen table with her parents on a Tuesday evening in late June, put the notebook down between the salt cellar and the lamp, and presented what she had spent 2 years preparing. She spoke for 25 minutes. She did not ask for permission. She did not apologize for the length of her research or the specificity of her numbers. She explained the market, the premium domestic handle market, not the commodity replacement handle market that Reuben Thatch's hardware store sold at 40 cents apiece. She explained the supply situation with ash timber. She explained why hickory was difficult for large mills and therefore not directly competitive for small producers who could manage the additional processing requirements. She explained her cost structure from raw material to finished product, including labor and equipment amortization. She explained that she had written letters to 3 buyers, 2 hardware suppliers in Columbus and 1 in Pittsburgh, and had received responses from 2 of them expressing interest in seeing samples. She had drawn a diagram of the drying kiln she could build from materials available locally. She had priced a used bandsaw at a mill auction in Findlay. She had priced the hygrometer she would need through a scientific instruments catalog that shipped to Ohio. Total capital required to begin operations, between $320 and $480, depending on equipment condition. She was asking for $250. Garland set his fork down about 5 minutes into the presentation. He did not pick it up again. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet enough to hear the lamp oil burning. Garland looked at the notebook for a long time. He looked at his daughter. He said he needed to think about it, his voice carrying the careful flatness of a man, trying not to commit to anything in either direction before he had processed what he'd heard. Bess did not say anything at the table. She began clearing dishes with the unhurried efficiency of a woman who has made a decision and is waiting for the right moment to say so. That night, after Willa had gone upstairs, Bess put the notebook on the table in front of Garland without comment. She had quietly retrieved it from where Willa had left it and went to wash the dishes. Garland sat with it for an hour. He turned pages. He looked at the yield calculations, the equipment list, the letters from the Columbus buyers, reproduced in Willa's hand on the back pages. He was not a man who read quickly. He read the way he did everything, methodically, without rushing, returning to things he wanted to verify. Bess said, her back to him, not turning from the basin, "She's right about the market. I asked Aaron Hendricks at the hardware store last Tuesday. He told me he can't find quality hickory handles to stock reliably, has to take what the Cincinnati wholesaler sends him, and the quality has been inconsistent for 2 years." Garland didn't answer immediately. He turned another page. "That pile is mostly junk," he said finally. Bess set a plate on the drying rack. "She knows that. That's the point she's making." Garland closed the notebook. He sat with his hands flat on the cover for a moment. Then he set it aside and looked out the dark kitchen window toward the back pasture, where the log pile was invisible in the night but present. In the way that things you've looked at for 9 years are always present, whether you can see them or not. The next morning, he told Willa he would give her $125, half what she'd asked, and the use of the back corner of the small equipment shed. He did not say he believed it would work. He said he was willing to let her try. Those are not the same statement. But in the Crestwood household in the summer of 1885, they were close enough. You need to understand Reuben Thatch before you can understand what happened at the Grange meeting in September. Because Reuben Thatch was not a villain, and he was not stupid. And both of those things matter. He was 67 years old, had operated the largest farm supply and hardware concern in Kenton for 31 years, and had attended Grange meetings for every one of those 31 years in the specific capacity of being the most reliably informed person in whatever room he occupied. He had earned that reputation. Over 3 decades, he had watched the Hardin County agricultural economy closely enough to develop a detailed understanding of what worked and what didn't, what opportunities were real, and which ones collapsed on contact with market conditions, logistics realities, and the basic friction of converting a good idea into a sustainable operation. He had seen the Milo buyer not come back in 1871. He had seen the merino sheep venture fail in 1878. He had watched the tobacco families to the south absorb losses that two of them were still recovering from in 1885. He had developed from these observations and dozens of others a pattern. Young people, or optimistic older ones, arrived at a convincing idea that worked on paper, invested resources they could not easily replace, encountered the gap between theoretical and operational, and lost. The pattern was real. The pattern was well documented. Reuben Thatch had been right about enough individual instances of it that his confidence in the pattern itself had stopped requiring validation. The problem with pattern recognition that stops requiring validation is that it cannot update. The tobacco venture in 1881 had failed for specific reasons: an overextended credit structure, a single buyer relationship that concentrated risk, a curing process more labor-intensive than projected, a market price shift that arrived 14 months after commitment. The Hickory handle situation in 1885 was different from the tobacco venture in almost every structural dimension. Zero acquisition cost for raw material, pre-existing physical infrastructure, a market not dependent on a single buyer, a product with demonstrated demand at premium price points, a producer who had spent 2 years doing precisely the kind of research the tobacco investors had not done. But those differences required looking at the specifics. Reuben Thatch had a pattern that had worked reliably enough that looking at the specifics had started to feel like unnecessary work. News of Willa's plan had moved through Hardin County's informal information network the way unusual things always move through small counties, imprecisely, with a kind of reliable velocity that has nothing to do with accuracy. Someone at the co-op elevator had mentioned it. Someone who shared a fence line with the Crestwood property had mentioned it to someone else. By August, the version circulating was that Garland Crestwood's girl, who'd gone to college, was planning to sell homemade axe handles from her father's equipment shed. Close enough to the truth to be recognizable. Far enough from it to be misleading in all the ways that mattered. Reuben Thatch heard the version circulating. He formed an opinion based on the pattern. The opinion was not formed out of malice. It was formed out of 31 years of watching the pattern repeat. The Hardin County Grange chapter met on the second Thursday of every month at First Methodist Church in Kenton, a plain room with plain chairs, a podium that listed slightly to the left, and a coal stove in the corner that took 40 minutes to warm the space adequately in months when warming was needed. September did not yet require warming. 40 members attended, roughly the chapter's average. Of those, 44 were under 35, a number that said something about the county's agricultural future that no one said out loud during meetings. The patrons of husbandry had accepted women as full members since the organization's founding in 1867, an unusual position for a formal institution in that era, one that had made the Grange a somewhat different kind of room than most institutional rooms Willa had experience with. She sat 3 rows from the front on the left side, the notebook on her lap, the same worn cover that had spent 2 years in her jacket pocket. She had expected this evening. She had, in fact, been expecting it since the afternoon in August, when she'd overheard a conversation at the post office that told her precisely which version of her plan was circulating in the county. Reuben Thatch raised the matter during the open discussion portion of the meeting in the way that men accustomed to occupying authority in rooms like this raise matters they have already decided about, not as questions, but as bulletins from the land of settled facts. He said he'd heard Garland Crestwood's daughter had come back from Columbus with a plan to sell axe handles from her daddy's equipment shed. He said it with a particular quality of smile, not mean, not contemptuous, just utterly certain, the smile of a man who has seen this situation before and knows exactly how it ends. He said the handle market had been consolidated by the large mills in Cincinnati and Philadelphia for 20 years. He said the tooling costs alone would absorb whatever margin the operation could generate in the first year. He said he had nothing against ambition in young people, particularly young women who had worked for an education, but that ambition and market reality were different things, and the gap between them was where most ventures of this type encountered their difficulties. He said it kindly. That was almost worse than unkindness, because kindness made it sound like settled geography rather than opinion, like he was describing terrain he'd personally surveyed, rather than a conclusion he'd reached by analogy. A sound moved through the room. Not quite laughter, something softer, more reflexive, The sound of people who had heard Reuben Thatch make assessments like this before and found him to be right often enough that the response came automatically before anyone had independently evaluated what they'd heard. Willa stood up. She was 23 years old. She was wearing the barn jacket she'd had since high school. The notebook was in her left hand. She did not look flustered. She looked like someone who had been given exactly the opening she had prepared for. She said, "The market Mr. Thatch was describing, commodity replacement handles, large volume production for wholesale distribution to general stores, was not the market she was entering. The premium domestic handle market, handles sold to serious users who understood the difference between a hickory blank cut from straight-grained American timber and a composite pressed product, had characteristics that were entirely different from what he'd described. That market was growing. The growth was being driven by the declining supply of quality ash timber and by the increasing frustration of premium buyers with the consistency of what the Cincinnati and Philadelphia mills were delivering. She said her raw material cost was near zero because the feedstock had been accumulating on her family's property for 9 years as mill reject stock that the Kenton operation would otherwise have hauled to the county disposal yard. Her per-unit production cost, including labor, equipment amortization, and finishing materials, was between 18 and 25 cents per handle depending on type. Her wholesale price floor was $1.20. 2 buyers had already responded to her letters with expressions of interest in seeing samples. She was not asking for anyone's investment. She was stating a business plan. Reuben Thatch's smile had contracted somewhere in the middle of what she'd said. By the end, it was a smaller, quieter thing, still present, but no longer carrying its original certainty without visible effort. "Well," he said, in the tone that means the conversation is over and the speaker has decided to let events do the arguing, "I wish you the best of luck with it." Willa looked at him for a moment. "Thank you, Mr. Thatch." Her voice was level and did not waste any energy on irony. She sat back down. The meeting moved on to other matters. Willa's neighbor to the right, a man named Fletcher, who ran 200 acres of oats and corn east of the Crestwood property, leaned slightly toward her after a few minutes and said, just above a whisper, "Good numbers." She nodded once. After the meeting, she drove home on the county road that ran past the back corner of the Crestwood property. It was full dark, the September sky clear and cold, stars visible the way they are only in places with no competing light. She slowed the horse as she always slowed when passing the log pile, and in the faint reach of the carriage lamp she could see the stacked shapes of the hickory logs. 9 years of accumulation, 9 winters of freeze and thaw, 9 springs of new growth pushing up around the outer edges. She stopped the horse. The pile looked exactly as it had always looked, like a problem someone else had left, like material that had been written off before it had been understood. It looked like that to anyone who hadn't done the arithmetic. Willa Crestwood had done the arithmetic. She had done it for 2 years, and it was right. The gap between a correct arithmetic and a proven one was what the coming months would close. She sat with the horse a moment longer, listening to the animals breathing, the wind moving through the cut cornfields on both sides of the road, the silence that is not really silence when you're paying attention. Then she clicked the horse forward. She drove the rest of the way home. She went inside, spoke briefly with her mother about the meeting, said goodnight, went upstairs. She was at the equipment shed at 5 in the morning. She began with the log pile. Not with the equipment. Equipment could wait until she knew exactly what she was working with. She borrowed her father's cant hook from the main barn and spent the first morning learning which logs could be moved safely and which had sunk deep enough into the ground to require the draft horse. She marked the outer edges of the pile with a chalk line, establishing a working grid so she could approach the assessment systematically rather than by feel. The hygrometer had not arrived yet. She had ordered it 2 weeks earlier from a Cincinnati scientific instrument supplier. In the meantime, she used what she had, her hands, her eyes, the knife she carried for fieldwork. She split test sections from the ends of logs, using a froe she'd borrowed from her father, reading the interior grain against what she'd learned from the forestry publications and from the hours she'd spent at Ohio A&M with the college's small collection of wood sample cross-sections. She was looking for 2 things: grain orientation relative to the log's axis, which determined whether a blank cut from that section would have the structural properties a handle required, and the presence of interior checking or rot that would make a section unusable regardless of how it looked from outside. The assessment took 4 weeks, log by log, grid section by grid section. She kept records in the notebook's back pages: log number, estimated dimensions of usable sections, likely handle types each section could yield, notes on grain character and any defects. At the end of 4 weeks, she had a complete inventory of what she was actually working with. Roughly 40% of the pile's volume was genuinely unusable, too deeply checked, too rotted at the contact points where wood had sat on wet ground went through 9 winters, too severely twisted to yield a section of adequate length with workable grain. The remaining 60% had something to offer, though what it offered was more varied than a simple estimate of usable blanks could capture. Some logs had long sections of dense, straight-grained wood that would yield full-length axe handles of 36 inches. The most valuable type, the type the Columbus buyer had specifically mentioned. Others had shorter usable runs better suited to hatchet and hammer handles. A small number, perhaps a dozen logs across the whole pile, had something that hadn't been part of her original projections. Sections where the grain moved in tight, regular waves, dense and even, the product of years of slow growth under specific conditions. This figured grain was precisely what made those logs impossible to run through production mill equipment. It was also precisely what made a handle cut from such a section unusual in ways that serious buyers would recognize and pay for. She hadn't counted on finding it. She recorded it carefully and revised her revenue estimates upward by a modest percentage she felt she could actually defend. Total yield estimate, 800 to 1,100 usable blanks across all handle types. She wrote the estimate in the notebook. Below it she wrote, "The pile is not what it looks like from the road. It is not what it looks like from the Grange meeting room. It is what the arithmetic says it is. The arithmetic says it is enough to begin." The first equipment purchase was the bandsaw. A mill in Findlay that had upgraded to a larger model was selling its old 14-inch machine for $43, with a spare blade included that needed dressing but was otherwise serviceable. Willa drove to Findlay on a Wednesday, examined the machine for 40 minutes, tested it with a scrap of oak the mill owner provided, negotiated the price to $41, and arranged transportation to Kenton for an additional $2. The transaction consumed 33% of her starting capital. She considered that acceptable for the most critical piece of equipment she would need. The drying kiln she built herself over 2 weekends. The design came from a forestry extension bulletin published by the Ohio State Board of Agriculture, modified based on her own calculations and a suggestion from one of the Kentucky handle makers she'd corresponded with, who had noted that standard designs ran too warm for Hickory and that dropping the operating temperature by 15% and extending the cycle accordingly produced dramatically better results. The materials, a large wooden chest lined with sawdust-filled burlap for insulation, a small coal burner purchased secondhand from a Kenton hardware estate, a section of copper pipe for heat distribution, and a hinged vent system fabricated from salvaged barn door hardware. Total material cost, $26. The hygrometer arrived from Cincinnati in the second week of September. She calibrated it against 2 reference samples before she trusted it with anything that mattered. By the middle of September, the morning of the Grange meeting, she had the kiln built, the bandsaw operational, the log pile fully assessed and inventoried, and $21 remaining after equipment purchases. She had a notebook that was right. She had a pile of hickory that was not what it looked like from the road. What she did not yet have was proof. Proof required starting, and starting required the next morning. The equipment shed was dark when she arrived at 5 in the morning the day after the Grange meeting. She lit the lantern, hung it on the hook her father had put in the rafter years ago for that purpose, and stood in the space for a moment before beginning. The bandsaw stood in the corner to her left. The kiln occupied the back wall. The hookboard where she intended to hang finished handles was empty. 30 pegs her father had let her install the previous week, arranged in rows, enough for the first batch and the second and the third. They were empty. Everything was still potential. The notebook was right, but the notebook was still just a notebook until the first blank was cut and dried and shaped and oiled and hung on one of those pegs in a form that someone would pay for. She picked up the cant hook. She went out to the log pile. She began. The first batch of blanks went into the kiln on a Thursday in late October, 11 days after the hygrometer had confirmed. The freshly cut sections were reading between 42 and 48% moisture content, green timber, carrying the water of 9 Ohio winters through its grain. Willa had cut 31 blanks from 7 logs in the first sorting tier, the ones she'd identified as highest probability for full-length axe handles. Working the band saw 4 hours each morning before the light changed and the cold in the shed, unreliable on the feed guide. She had dressed the saw's blade twice already, learning the particular way Hickory took the edge. Not aggressively, not all at once, but with a persistent accumulative resistance that wore metal differently than oak or ash. The kiln ran on the coal burner set low, the copper pipe distributing heat through the insulated chest in a slow convection she had calculated and adjusted based on the Kentucky correspondence. Target temperature inside the chest, between 95 and 105 degrees Fahrenheit, held steady. The vent system allowed moisture-laden air to escape at a controlled rate. The hygrometer lived inside the chest on a small shelf, readable through a glass panel she'd cut into the lid. She checked it every 4 hours, including twice through the night the first 3 nights, carrying the lantern across the dark yard, lifting the lid carefully to read the instrument without disturbing the airflow, recording the numbers in the notebook she kept on the shelf above the burner. The readings dropped as expected through the first 48 hours, then slowed. Hickory gave up its surface moisture readily enough. The interior was another matter. On the 6th day, the exterior readings had reached the target range. She pulled one blank from the stack, cut a thin cross-section from its center with a fine-tooth handsaw, weighed it on the small grain scale she'd borrowed from her mother's kitchen, dried it over the burner for 2 hours, weighed it again, calculated the moisture content from the weight difference. The result was 23%, still green inside, the surface deceptively dry, while the core held what it had always held. She extended the cycle. Day 11, 16% at center. Better. Not enough. Day 15, the cross-section test read 9.5% at the core, 9.2 at the outer quarter. She allowed herself to take 3 blanks and test them at the draw knife bench. 2 cut clean. The third showed a hairline check running 3 inches along the interior face, invisible until the spoke shave passed over it. She set that blank aside, marked it in the notebook, added a note, watch for interior stress in sections from logs that showed exterior checking before processing. 22 clean blanks emerged from the first batch. She had projected 24 to 27. The yield was lower than projected. She updated the notebook. Then she got to work on the handles themselves. The draw knife bench was a simple thing, a length of hardwood bolted to a low frame, with a foot lever that clamped the workpiece in place, freeing both hands for the draw knife. She had built it from plans sketched by hand from a description in a woodworking manual at the Ohio A&M library. The draw knife itself had been her grandfather Cyrus's, a heavy tool with a curved blade and turned ash handles that were now, she noted with the particular irony of the moment, drier and more consistently grained than most of what the Kenton mill currently produced. Axe handle geometry is not complicated in principle. An oval cross-section that transitions from a wider grip area to a narrower throat just above the eye, with a gentle swell at the base that prevents the hand from sliding off under impact load. The challenge is consistency, producing that geometry repeatedly, across different blanks with different grain orientations, at a quality level that a buyer would accept without knowing or caring about the specific difficulties of each piece of wood. The first handle took her 4 hours. The result was good, straight, smooth, the oval cross-section consistent along its length, the throat transition clean. She hung it on the first peg of the hook board and stepped back. The second handle took 3 hours and 20 minutes. The third, 2 hours and 50. By the 8th handle, she was working in 2 hours flat, not because the work had gotten easier, but because her hands had stopped asking permission before they moved. She finished the first batch of 22 handles in 11 working days, working 5 to 6 hours at the draw knife bench each afternoon after spending mornings on blank cutting and kiln monitoring. She oiled each handle with raw linseed oil, 3 thin coats over 3 successive evenings, letting each coat soak before applying the next. The oil darkened the grain slightly, made the figure and the more complex pieces come forward, gave the surface a quality that was not a finish exactly, but a preparation. The wood made ready for use rather than for display. She hung all 22 on the hook board. She looked at them for a long time. They were good, not perfect. Handle 7 had a slight asymmetry in the throat transition visible only in certain light. Handle 14 had a grain run out in the upper third within acceptable tolerance, but handles 3, 9, 16, and 20 were what she would call exceptional. Pieces where the grain had cooperated with the geometry in ways that produced something that looked almost inevitable, as though the shape had been waiting in the wood for someone to find it. Sheet the assessment in the notebook. She wrote the problems alongside the successes, because the problems were also information, because a notebook that only recorded what went right was not a notebook that could be trusted. Then she started the second batch. The second batch was when things went wrong in a way that mattered. For 36 blanks from the next tier of sorted logs, she was trying to improve her efficiency. 15 days per kiln cycle meant 2 weeks before she could load again. If she could shorten it, she could increase throughput. She found an article in an 1881 edition of the Ohio Farmer describing a commercial kiln operation running Hickory at higher temperature with a shorter cycle. She adjusted her burner output, raising the interior temperature by an estimated 20 degrees. She watched the hygrometer carefully, watching the surface readings drop faster, feeling the logic of it. Faster evaporation, same endpoint, less time. On day 9, the surface readings matched her day 11 readings from the first batch. Core moisture, 27%, still too high. She left it 4 more days. Day 13, core 11%. Close enough, she told herself. She pulled the first 3 blanks tested at the draw knife bench cut clean. The 4th opened a check along its interior face that ran 8 inches. Nearly the full working length of the handle. The 5th did the same. The 6th split entirely under spoke, shave pressure, a clean fracture following the grain like it had been waiting for an excuse. She stopped. Set the spoke shave down, case hardening. The surface had dried faster than the interior, creating tension between the outer shell and the core that the wood held in suspension until something provided the occasion for it to release. She had read about case hardening in the forestry bulletin. She had noted it as a risk. She had not weighed it heavily enough against the appeal of a shorter cycle. Of the 36 blanks, 14 showed no stress and passed assessment. 19 showed case hardening in various degrees. 3 she couldn't assess without consuming them in the process of testing. She set the usable 14 aside and looked at the pile of compromised blanks, 19 pieces of wood that had been in the log pile for 9 years, in the kiln for 13 days, and were now kindling. The material cost was not what troubled her. What troubled her was the time. 13 days committed to this batch, hours of blank cutting. The realization that her efficiency calculation had cost her more time than it would have saved. She wrote a full analysis in the notebook. Every decision she had made, the reasoning behind each one, where the reasoning had been correct and where it had failed to account for what the material was actually doing. She extended the drying cycle to 17 days, 2 days longer than her original 15, a conservative correction rather than a return to the same position. She lowered the kiln temperature to 5 degrees below her original setting. She designed a more rigorous cross-section test protocol requiring confirmation at 2 depths before she considered a batch complete. When she finished writing, she went out to the log pile, because the log pile was where she went when she needed to think about something that had no immediate solution. It was the first week of December. The temperature had dropped below freezing during the day and well below it at night, and the logs at the outer edges of the pile had a skim of ice on their north faces. She walked along the inventory grid, looking at the chalk marks and the assessment notations she'd made on each log section with a lumber crayon. The inventory was still accurate. The yield estimate still held. The batch failure had consumed material she'd planned to use, but had not destabilized the overall numbers. She was standing at the pile's north edge, working through the arithmetic on the modified cycle, when she heard the equipment shed door and then the sound of boots on the frozen ground. Her father appeared at the edge of the lantern's range, carrying a lantern of his own, wearing his heavy canvas coat with the collar turned up. He walked to where she was standing and stopped, looking at the log pile. The 2 lanterns pushed the darkness back in a wider circle than either one alone. After what felt like several minutes, Garland's breath made a slow cloud in the cold. Your grandfather sat in a field in November of 1873 for about 2 hours, not doing anything, just sitting. Willa looked at the ice on the near log. What was he thinking about? He never said, but he planted the same field in spring, didn't change what he planted, didn't change how he planted it. He just sat with whatever he was sitting with until he was done sitting with it. She understood what he was telling her and what he was not telling her. She turned and looked at him directly. I'm not done. I made a mistake in the second batch. I know exactly what the mistake was, and I've already corrected the protocol. Garland's expression did not change much. His hand went into his coat pocket and came out with something, a folded envelope. He held it out. She took it. $50. Don't tell your mother I had it separate. His voice measured, carrying something adjacent to an apology, for the original 125 having been half of what she'd asked for. She'll want to know where it came from, and I'd rather not have that conversation. She held the envelope in the cold. Where did it come from? A pause. Something moved across his face that she'd rarely seen there. A small, brief admission. I had it set aside, for something I've been deciding about for a year. He looked back at the log pile. I decided about it. He turned and walked back toward the house without saying what it had been set aside for. She watched him until the light from his lantern dimmed around the corner of the barn. She stood with the $50 in one hand and her own lantern in the other. She was not in danger of stopping. She had not been in danger of stopping. But there was a particular quality to continuing in the presence of someone who had silently decided to make continuing easier. And that quality was not something she had a word for in any of her notebooks. She went inside. She sat at her desk by the window and rewrote the entire kiln protocol from the beginning. Every step, every monitoring interval, every test procedure, in the clearest handwriting she could manage, as though writing instructions for someone who had never done it before and could not afford to make any of the mistakes she had already made. By the time she finished, it was past 1 in the morning. She read it through once, made 2 small corrections, folded it into the notebook. The third batch loaded on a Monday in mid-December, 33 blanks, a mix of axe and hatchet stock. She ran the new protocol exactly as written. Day 7, Day 10, Day 14, Day 17, 4 checkpoint measurements, 2 depths each time, both readings required to confirm before she progressed. She added a 5th checkpoint at Day 19 because the second depth reading on Day 17 was still half a point above target. Day 19, both reading 7.2 and 6.8% clean. She pulled the batch on a Thursday morning in early January 1886, tested every blank at the draw knife bench before committing to any shaping work. 30 blanks passed. 3 showed minor stress, not case hardening, but a slight internal tension that presented as a very fine surface check when spoke shave pressure was applied at the narrow throat. 2 of those 3 stabilized over the following week and could be worked with careful attention to the problem area. The third she set aside permanently. 32 clean blanks from 33, the best yield she had achieved. She wrote the numbers in the notebook. Below them she wrote, the mistake in batch 2 was not carelessness. It was impatience masquerading as efficiency. The distinction matters because carelessness is a habit and impatience is a decision. Decisions can be made differently. She had not written that for anyone but herself. She read it once, left it, went back to the draw knife bench. By the end of January, she had finished handles from the third batch and written to Aldous Webb in Columbus that she would be ready to show samples in February. Webb wrote back within 10 days confirming he could receive her in the second week of February and expressing, in the careful understatement of commercial correspondence, that he was glad she had followed through. She drove to Columbus on a Tuesday, a 4-hour journey on roads that had been passable for 3 weeks following the January thaw. She brought 12 handles in a wooden box padded with wool scraps, 6 full-length axe handles, 4 hatchet handles, 2 hammer handles, each one wrapped separately. The 2 exceptional pieces from the first batch included the ones where grain had cooperated with geometry in ways she couldn't fully take credit for, the ones where Hickory had done something she'd helped it do but hadn't caused. Aldous Webb's store occupied the ground floor of a 2-story building on the east side of Columbus's commercial district. Hardware and agricultural tools arranged on heavy wooden shelves that reached the ceiling and required a rolling ladder on a track to access the upper rows. Webb himself was 60, compact, gray-bearded, with the dry hands of a man who handled metal and wood all day and had for a long time. He looked at the handles the way she had hoped someone who knew what they were looking at would look at them. Not quickly, not with the polite attention of someone being courteous, but with the slowing focus of someone recalibrating an expectation. He picked up the first exceptional handle and turned it in both hands, ran his thumb along the full length of the grip section, feeling the oval cross-section transition, held it at arm's length and sighted down the axis, checking for straightness, put it against his palm and applied light torque, feeling for the grain response under torsional load, set it down carefully. Where's the material from? His voice was direct, not skeptical, asking for information.
My family's farm.
Hardin County. Mill reject stock that accumulated over 9 years. The mill's loss tolerance for hickory is lower than for softer species. Anything that doesn't run clean through production equipment goes to disposal. This came from that stream. Webb looked at the handle again, then at the others. All from the same source? The entire current inventory. I have a supply arrangement with the mill that will continue beyond the farm's existing stock. He picked up one of the hatchet handles, ran the same thumb-along grain assessment. The finish, raw linseed oil. 3 coats, each allowed to fully absorb before the next. No lacquer, no varnish. The wood stays workable. A user who wants to sand and re-oil after a year of use will find it accepts that readily. Webb set the hatchet handle down with the others. He looked at the arrangement for a moment, then at Willa. I can move 36 axe handles at $1.20 wholesale. If the consistency holds, if what I receive matches what I'm looking at, I'll want to establish a regular arrangement. 36 handles at $1.20, $43.20. Per cost to produce them, including material, labor, equipment amortization, and finishing supplies, $11.80. She had already performed this calculation in the notebook the night before, anticipating the conversation. The consistency will hold, her voice carrying the specific flatness of someone stating a fact rather than making a promise. The arrangement was made. She drove back to Hardin County on roads that had gotten muddier since morning, the wooden box empty on the seat beside her. The contract letter Webb had written by hand folded in her coat pocket. What she felt was not relief. It was closer to the quiet recognition of a hypothesis confirmed. Not surprising because she had believed the hypothesis, but satisfying in the specific way that evidence satisfies rather than in the way that hope satisfies. The 36 axe handles went out to Columbus in April. Webb confirmed receipt and quality. He placed a second order, 50 hatchet handles, delivery in 8 weeks. The Ohio State Fair came in September 1886, 11 months after the Grange meeting. Willa was there because Aldous Webb had suggested it, with the specific understatement of a man who had been in commercial trade long enough to know that a direct recommendation from a supplier's existing buyer carried weight it was impolitic to say directly. The cost of a display table, $2.50 for 3 days. She brought 12 handles selected to show range rather than peak quality. 2 exceptional pieces, 4 solid workmanlike pieces, 3 hatchet handles, 2 hammer handles, 1 draw knife handle she'd made experimentally from a short-figured section that had been too dense and irregular for anything else and had produced, under the draw knife, a shape she hadn't planned for and found she liked better than what she'd planned. The fair's agricultural industrial hall smelled of sawdust, machine oil, and the particular dry warmth of a large enclosed space with too many people in it. She set the handles on a length of dark canvas, spaced so each one was visible without having to move others, with the hygrometer and the notebook's cross-section testing records positioned at the corner of the table for anyone who wanted to understand the process behind the products. Most people passed without stopping. She was not there for most people. On the second afternoon, a man stopped. He was perhaps 50 broad across the shoulders, wearing a wool vest that had been well made and was now well worn, the kind of garment kept rather than replaced because its owner did not purchase things he intended to discard. He picked up the draw knife handle without asking, which told her something about how he related to objects. He turned it twice, set it down, picked up the exceptional axe handle, ran the same thumb-along grain assessment that Aldous Webb had used. His name was Marcus Holloway. He represented a purchasing network supplying hardware and tool retailers across Ohio, Pennsylvania, Indiana, and Michigan. Not one store, not one city, but a network of independent retailers who shared a buying arrangement to achieve the volume discounts individual stores couldn't reach alone. He was direct, specific in his questions, not interested in pleasantries. Material source, drying method, grain orientation protocol, current production capacity, lead time. She answered each question without expanding beyond what was asked. He was measuring her against something. Not her answers, but the precision of her answers. Whether she understood the subject well enough to be exact or was approximating in ways that would create problems later. The conversation lasted 22 minutes. At its end, Holloway said he wanted 200 full-length axe handles, delivery within 8 weeks at $1.40 per unit. 200 handles, 8 weeks. Her current production, running alone with her mother, helping on finishing days and Edmund cutting blanks 4 mornings a week, was approximately 20 to 25 handles per week, depending on log complexity. 200 in 8 weeks was 25 per week without interruption, without equipment failure, without a batch complication. She looked at Holloway's card, Pittsburgh address. 8 weeks from receipt of deposit. He produced a deposit letter on the spot, a pre-written form he carried, filled in the amounts in a neat clerk's hand, signed it, left it on the table, picked up 2 more handles to look at once more, set them down, and walked toward the next exhibit without looking back. She stood at the table for a moment after he'd gone. 15 days per kiln cycle, each batch yielding 25 to 30 clean blanks, 2 full silks for the blanks, overlapping with shaping work on the first batch. Edmund every morning, her mother 2 afternoons a week on finishing. Her own hours extended to the limit of what the lantern and the cold would permit. It was tight. It was not impossible. The difference between tight and impossible was the thing she had understood during the 22 minutes of Holloway's questions. She wrote a note in the notebook on the way home. 200 units. 8 weeks confirmed. Adjust kiln loading to begin Monday. Brief Edmund Sunday evening on required hours through November. She delivered 202 handles to Holloway's Pittsburgh contact office in the first week of November. 2 days inside the 8-week deadline, the extra 2 handles included at no charge as a demonstration that her inventory management was running slightly ahead of her commitments rather than behind. Holloway placed a second order within 10 days, 150 handles, same specifications, delivery in 6 weeks. Through December and into the winter of 1886, going into 1887, Willa worked with the methodical focus that had replaced the anxiety of the first months. Not because the work had gotten easier, but because she had gotten better at it. The handles improved. Her assessment of the log inventory deepened. She identified in December a group of 12 logs near the pile's interior that she had marked during the initial assessment as moderate quality and now reassessed as high, having developed since September the ability to read grain orientation from the exterior with an accuracy she hadn't possessed in September. She wrote in the notebook, "Initial assessment conservative by design. Conservatism in estimates is correct. The revision upward is not an error corrected, it is skill developed." By the end of 1886, the numbers in the notebook had crossed from theory into evidence. Revenue, $748. Operating costs including labor, equipment amortization, finishing materials and transportation, $287. Net, $461. Not a fortune. Not what Hardin County would have called comfortable money. But it was money from material that had been a disposal problem 14 months earlier. From a corner of the property that had been doing nothing for 9 years. From a market that Reuben Thatch had described as consolidated and closed, and beyond the reach of someone working from an equipment shed, County Road outside Kenton. She wrote the year-end numbers on the last day of December. She looked at them for a moment. Then she went to the kiln, checked the moisture readings on the current batch, adjusted the vent by a 1/4 inch, recorded the readings, went back to the house. The summer of 1887 passed well. Revenue through the year reached $1,840, net just over $1,000. Her first year of genuinely profitable operation, the kind of profit that allowed her to repay her father the full $175 she had taken from him, plus interest she calculated herself at the county bank rate, which he accepted without argument after initially arguing. She hired Ida Pruitt, widow of a Kenton mill worker, 41 years old, steady and quick to learn. For finishing work 3 days per week at 30 cents per day, which freed Willa's afternoons for blank cutting and kiln work and expanded weekly output without proportional increase in her own hours. She was also watching the weather in a way she hadn't the previous 2 years. The summer of 1887 had been dry in July, but recovered in August. Her father's corn yield came in at 168 bushels per acre on the good ground, below average but manageable. She noted it without saying anything to him about the comparison she was making. The summer of 1888 was different. It announced itself in May, too little rain at planting, then a June with heat that arrived early and stayed, then July and August with combined precipitation that the county agricultural report measured at 1.4 inches against a 30-year average of 7.8. The corn that had gone into the ground in May under adequate conditions came out of August looking like evidence of a failure of faith. Willa Crestwood's corn yield at harvest came in at 122 bushels per acre on his best ground. On the lighter soil in the northwest quarter, it came in at 98. He had rented the northwest quarter from his neighbor Harold Fenn at a cash rate negotiated in February, when February's rains had suggested an adequate season. The rental payment was due regardless of yield. He went to the bank in Kenton on a Wednesday in October. Willa was in the equipment shed when she heard the wagon return in the early afternoon. Earlier than she would have expected if the conversation at the bank had gone smoothly, she didn't go out. She heard her father's boots on the porch, the door, the kitchen. She heard her mother's voice, too quiet to distinguish words, and then silence. That evening after, Garland sat with his hands around a cup of coffee that had stopped steaming. Bess moved through the kitchen's closing routines with the controlled efficiency of a woman managing her own feelings with practiced care. After Bess had gone upstairs and Edmund had retreated to his room, Garland remained at the table. Willa came in from the equipment shed. She had been running the evening kiln check and found him there with her notebook open in front of him. Not the current notebook, the first one, the one from Ohio A&M set aside when it filled, now living on the shelf above the draw knife bench. He had gone to the shed and taken it himself. The first time he had done such a thing, and brought it back. He was reading the yield calculations near the back. The pages she'd written in her most compressed handwriting, the ones showing the arithmetic underpinning everything she'd told him. At the kitchen table 3 years earlier, she poured herself water from the pitcher and sat down at the far end of the table, at the corner, giving him the reading angle, without requiring him to look at her while he finished. After 10 minutes, he closed the notebook. He looked at it with something she had not seen in him directed toward her work before. The specific expression of someone reading numbers that have arrived, in some important sense, too late to change what the numbers beside them say. He knew his corn yield. He knew his rental commitment. He knew what the bank conversation had produced. He was placing the columns side by side and letting them sit there. Ashford Handle Works had not had a drought. The kiln ran on coal, not rain. The log supply was unaffected by temperature or precipitation. The orders from Holloway's network had come in through August and September without reduction. Revenue through October 1888, $2,910. Net through October, estimated at $1,400, with 2 months remaining in the year. Garland's hand rested on the cover of the notebook. You understood what this was before I did. Willa looked at the notebook under his hand. I understood the arithmetic. You understood everything the arithmetic didn't say. It took both. He was quiet for a moment. I'm not sure that's entirely true. The $50 in December of 1885, the decision you'd been sitting with for a year. She looked at him. Whatever that was, it was yours to make. I couldn't have made it for you. Something moved across his face that she couldn't name precisely, but recognized as belonging to a category of expression she'd seen rarely in him. Something that was not pride and not relief, but adjacent to both, mixed with the weight of time spent in so deep you don't realize the depth until you've stepped out of it long enough to look back. He slid the notebook back along the table toward her. His hand stayed on it a moment before releasing it. I want to talk to Virgil Pruitt. Not you should talk to Virgil Pruitt. The particular weight of the pronoun landing clearly. About formalizing the arrangement. He'll listen to me differently than he'll listen to you. At first, and after he's listening, you should be the one doing the talking. She looked at her father. 30 years of corn and soybeans had taught him the precise value of which conversations to be present for and which conversations to start. She hadn't expected him to know that about her situation. She should have expected it. When? Next week. Before he starts thinking too hard about next year's supply chain without us in it. She wrote it in the new notebook. Virgil Pruitt. Supply formalization, Garland attending. Then she looked at the hook board, visible through the open shed door in the lantern's reach. 43 handles hanging in rows, the most she'd had ready at once, the oiled grain of each one catching the light in its particular way. The hook board had been empty 14 months ago. She went back to the equipment shed. She checked the kiln. She recorded the readings. She went to the draw knife bench and picked up the handle she'd left at the throat-shaping stage that afternoon. And she worked it by lantern light until the geometry was right, until the cross-section was what it needed to be, until the wood had become the thing it had been capable of becoming, before she had known it was there. The conversation with Virgil Pruitt happened on a Tuesday in November 1888 in the Kenton Sawmill's yard office, a low-ceilinged room built against the side of the main building, smelling of pine resin and coal smoke, with a desk that had been buried under paper. For so long the paper had become the desk. Virgil was 38, square-shouldered, the kind of man who had inherited a competent operation and kept it competent through attention rather than innovation. He had known Willa Crestwood for 20 years, which was why the first 5 minutes of the meeting were about the harvest and about the railroad spur the county commissioners were debating. Then Garland turned in his chair and looked at Willa, and the meeting changed. She had prepared a single page of figures covering the arrangement she was proposing, regular delivery of rejected hickory and a portion of rejected white oak from the mill's yard, at a schedule to be agreed upon jointly, in exchange for a per-load disposal fee, calculated to be 12% below what the mill was currently paying for county landfill transport. She slid the page across to Virgil. He read it without picking it up. His finger moved along the cost columns. You've been taking the informal loads for 3 years. My father's arrangement with your father. I've been working from that stock. It's nearly exhausted, meaning you need a reliable stream. His finger tapped the disposal fee figure. This is lower than what I'm paying Hendricks for the hauling, by 12%. The difference is that I'm coming to you on a fixed schedule rather than requiring you to arrange transport. Your yard clears on a predictable timeline, no coordination cost. He looked at the page again. White oak as well, where the grain character makes it unsuitable for your standard run. Same profile as the hickory, sections your equipment finds problematic that my process is designed for. He was quiet long enough that Garland shifted in his chair. Virgil picked up the page finally and held it at a reading distance. I'll need 2 days to look at the disposal contract we have with Hendricks. If the numbers are what they appear to be, I don't see an objection. 2 days became 4. The response arrived by post on a Saturday, a brief handwritten letter confirming the arrangement with one modification. The schedule she'd proposed was monthly, and Virgil wanted bi-weekly to keep his yard from accumulating between deliveries. She wrote back the same afternoon agreeing, contingent on the first delivery arriving before December's end. The first delivery came 3 weeks later. 2 wagon loads of hickory and 1 of white oak. She inventoried the material that afternoon while the light lasted. The hickory was similar in character to what she'd been processing. The white oak was new territory, denser at the surface, slower to assess, But the 2 weeks since Virgil's letter had given her time to read everything she could find on white oak processing. The species had handle applications the market had not fully explored because domestic production had concentrated on hickory and ash, leaving white oak to the flooring and furniture trades. She made note of 3 white oak sections with grain character, suggesting potential for draw knife and adze handles. Specialty tools for timber framers and furniture makers, a market she had been circling for 6 months without the material to enter it. She set those sections aside under separate chalk marks. The year ended. Full year revenue, 1888, $3,420. Operating costs including Ida Pruett's wages, Edmund's compensation, equipment maintenance, consumables, and transportation, $1,580. Net income, $1,840. She looked at those numbers for a while. Then she looked at the notebook her father had read in October, the first notebook, on the shelf above the draw knife bench. In it, at the bottom of the final page of yield projections, she had written an estimate of what the operation might generate in its 3rd or 4th year of full operation. Between $1,500 and $2,200 net annually, if buyers materialized and quality held and the supply arrangement proved sustainable. She was at the upper edge of that estimate in the 4th year, with a supply arrangement freshly formalized and a market larger than the estimate had assumed. She did not revise the estimate upward. She started a new section in the current notebook and began projecting what the next 3 years might look like if the white oak line developed as she thought it could. January of 1889 brought Martha Gould. Martha had come through Ida Pruett, who had mentioned the operation to a woman at her church whose husband had died in August, leaving her with 2 children and a farm she couldn't operate alone and couldn't sell in a depressed market. Martha was 34, had grown up on a farm, knew wood the way farm women knew wood, functionally, practically, without romance. She learned the finishing process in 4 days and the blank assessment in 2 weeks. Delia Sims arrived in March through a different path. She had read a notice Willa had placed at the Kenton post office. Delia was 41, precise in the particular way of people who have spent years doing careful work in context that didn't value the care. She had worked as a seamstress for 12 years. Her spatial precision translated directly to the finishing process, and within a month she was doing work that required less oversight than what Willa herself had produced in her first 3 months. With Martha and Delia working alongside Ida 3 days per week, and Edmund maintaining his morning blank cutting role, the operation's weekly output reached 35 to 40 handles in peak weeks, nearly double what Willa had been producing alone in the first year. The increase didn't come free. Payroll consumed a significant portion of the revenue gain, and the administrative complexity of managing 4 other workers consumed time she had previously spent on processing. She built a quality checkpoint system into the workflow, with specific inspection points at blank assessment, after shaping, after finishing, before packing. Every handle that left the shed had passed 3 separate checks, 2 of them by someone other than the person who'd done the previous step. She described the system in the notebook, then added below it, "Quality is a process, not a disposition. A person can have good instincts and produce inconsistent work. A system with clear standards and multiple checkpoints produces consistency regardless of individual variation. The goal is not to trust the people are trustworthy, but to remove the conditions under which trusted people make avoidable mistakes." The provenance cards came out of a conversation she had not planned. In February, a letter arrived from Marcus Holloway in Pittsburgh. Not an order, but a note accompanying a returned card. The card was small, handmade, the size of a calling card, attached to a hatchet handle in Willa's most recent delivery, by a piece of string she'd tied through a small hole she'd drilled in the end grain. She had started adding the cards 2 months earlier on an impulse she hadn't fully analyzed. A few lines about the wood's origin, the kiln cycle, the grain character, written in her smallest clear script and paper she cut from the backs of used account sheets. Holloway's note said 3 things. His customers were asking about the cards. One had written specifically to ask whether the producer could provide more information about the drying method. Another had asked whether the figured grain handles could be specified directly in future orders. Holloway wanted to know whether she intended to continue the practice and whether the cards could be printed rather than handwritten, as the handwriting varied in ways that some customers found charming and others found inconsistent. She sat with the letter for an evening. Then she went to the small print shop on Kenton's main street, a 2-press operation run by a man named Horace Clement, and worked with him on a card format. 3 inches by 2, printed front and back, with fixed fields for wood species, harvest county, kiln cycle length, moisture content at release, and grain character notes with a blank line at the bottom for her to write in the specific characteristics of that individual handle. Cost per 100 cards, $2.80 or approximately 3 cents each. She wrote in the notebook, cards at 3 cents, perceived value added to each handle based on Holloway's customer responses, estimated 30 to 60 cents. The information was always there. The card makes it visible to someone who cannot see the process. A premium buyer is paying for the process as much as the product. They just need a way to know what the process was. The timber framing inquiry began at the Columbus Woodworking Exhibition in October 1889. She attended not to sell but to listen. She found the timber framers in the eastern corridor of the agricultural hall. A cluster of perhaps 15 men gathered around a display of hand tools with the focused attention of people for whom those tools were professional instruments. She walked past them twice, listening to the conversation, identifying who was asking questions and who was answering. The questioners were the ones she wanted. She introduced herself to 2 of them during the afternoon, not as a vendor but as someone developing a product line she wanted to understand before producing it at scale. The timber framers were not accustomed being asked what they needed by someone who appeared to understand what they did. The conversations ran longer than she'd anticipated. What she learned confirmed the shape of what she'd suspected and added dimensions she hadn't. The timber framing community needed specialty handles, not just Drought knives and adzes, but the less common tools. Slicks, corner chisels, twibles, tools whose handles had not been in commercial production for 20 years because the trade they served had contracted and the large manufacturers had followed the volume away from them. The community was small. It was also growing, driven by a revival of traditional construction methods among buyers who could afford craftsmanship and wanted it documented. The handles these craftsmen needed were not available from commercial sources at the quality they required. They were currently made by the craftsmen themselves, from whatever suitable wood they could source, which was not always suitable. She wrote everything down that evening in her Columbus boarding house room, filling 4 pages. The potential market was not large in unit volume terms. The margin per unit was considerably higher than her current product line. The customers were willing to wait for quality and willing to pay for specification, a particular species, a particular grain orientation, a particular handle geometry for a particular tool. White oak was one option. The 2 timber framers mentioned Osage orange as preferred for certain mallet and maul handles. Extremely dense, impact-resistant, with a natural oil content that resisted moisture. Black locust appeared in one conversation as the traditional material for draw knife handles in certain regional traditions. Neither species was being processed commercially for handle production. Both would, she was confident, be present in the reject streams of Ohio sawmills, for the same reasons Hickory had been. She returned to Hardin County on a Thursday and wrote 4 letters before the following Monday. One to Virgil Pruett, asking whether the mill's reject stream included Osage orange or black locust. One to a sawmill in Knox County she'd identified through the Ohio farmer as Process Hardwood. One to an equipment supplier in Cincinnati about a small lathe for turned handle geometries. And one to Marcus Holloway, asking whether his network included retailers serving the timber framing trade. 3 of the 4 letters received useful replies within 3 weeks. Virgil Pruett said his mill occasionally received Osage orange and would set it aside when it appeared. The Knox County mill received black locust regularly from a contractor clearing fence rows, had nowhere to put it, and would be glad to discuss a disposal arrangement. Holloway said one of his network retailers in Cincinnati had begun stocking tools specifically for the timber framing community and was actively looking for domestic specialty handle suppliers. The lathe she'd inquired about appeared at a Findlay Estate auction in December, a small floor-standing model, cast iron, the kind a pattern shop or cabinet maker might have used, and she purchased it for $31, her largest single equipment expenditure since the band saw. Edmund learned to operate it in a week, which was 1 week less than she'd estimated. The year 1889 ended with revenue of $6,840. Operating costs, $3,120. Net, $3,720. She wrote the numbers in the notebook on New Year's Eve, sitting at the draw knife bench with the lantern turned up, the rest of the shed dark. The hook board held 68 handles, the largest single inventory she'd carried. The provenance cards were stacked in a wooden box near the packing table. The lathe stood in its corner with a half-turned handle still mounted in the chuck, a white oak piece she'd been working on when the light had failed the previous afternoon. She thought about the year in which the number she was now looking at would have seemed not just improbable, but belonging to a different category of thing than what she was doing. She thought about the Grange meeting, about Reuben Thatch's quiet smile contracting in the middle of what she'd said. She thought about the second batch of blanks, the case hardening, the 19 pieces of compromised wood. She thought about her father in the December cold, with the envelope, the $50, the thing he'd been deciding about for a year. She closed the notebook. She went to bed. On a Tuesday in November 1889, before the notebook was closed on New Year's Eve, in the weeks between the Columbus exhibition and year's end, Reuben Thatch drove his wagon into the Crestwood yard. Willa heard the horse before she saw the wagon, coming out of the shed, with a finished handle in one hand and the spoke shave in the other. The afternoon light was flat and cold, the sky the color of weathered oak. Thatch was climbing down from the wagon seat when she came around the shed's corner, and he had the look of a man who had been preparing what he was going to say for longer than the drive from Kenton. He was 71. His hair was fully white, and he'd grown heavier in the 4 years since the Grange meeting. He had handed the daily management of his store to his son Clement the previous year. Willa set the handle and the spoke shave on the stack of lumber near the shed door. She waited. Thatch looked at the shed, the extended roof lines she'd added in the spring to cover the new receiving area, the stovepipe from the kiln's upgraded burner rising above the original roofline, the packing boxes stacked near the rear door, with Pittsburgh and Columbus addresses visible in the cold air. He looked at all of it with the expression of a man calibrating the distance between what he'd predicted and what existed. "I've heard the operation has done well this year." It has. Done well in a year when a number of operations in the county haven't. That's also true. His hands went into his coat pockets. "I have a nephew in Wyandotte County, Otis Fenwick. He has a woodlot that's been producing reject hickory for the past 4 years. The mill in Upper Sandusky won't take it, and he's been cutting it for firewood at a loss on his time. He wanted me to ask whether you'd be interested in sourcing from him." Willa looked at Reuben Thatch directly. He held the look. "I remember what you said at the Grange meeting in September of 1885. I imagine you do. You said the market for this kind of work had been consolidated by the large mills in Cincinnati and Philadelphia. You said it with a particular degree of confidence." Something moved across his face, not shame exactly, something more considered. The expression of a man who has spent time arriving at an honest accounting of a specific error. "I was wrong about the market. I was wrong about your ability to find it. I was wrong about the specific opportunity your material represented." A pause. "I said those things in a room full of people who trusted my judgment, and the judgment was wrong." It was more than she had expected him to say. More, in fact, than she would have required. "I'd be glad to talk to your nephew about a sourcing arrangement." Her voice carried no particular warmth, but also no remaining coldness, the neutrality of a transaction between equals rather than the neutrality of a withheld judgment. "The same terms I use with Virgil Pruett at the Kenton Mill. Fair to both parties, clear in writing with defined delivery schedules." Thatch nodded. "I expected nothing less. There's one thing." She let the wind move between them for a moment. "When your nephew's neighbor comes to him with an idea that doesn't look like what everyone in the county is already doing, I'd like him to have been told by you to listen before he forms an opinion." Reuben Thatch looked at her for a long moment. His expression had the quality of a man receiving something he recognized as deserved and was not going to argue with. "I'll tell him that. Then I'll write to Mr. Fenwick this week." They shook hands in the yard. His grip was firm, a businessman's grip, the same grip he'd have offered any counterparty. She watched him climb back onto the wagon, turn the horse, drive out to the county road. She stood in the yard until the wagon was gone, then went back into the shed. She wrote in the notebook, "Thatch, Wyandotte County Supply, Fenwick, write this week." Below that, after a pause, she added one more line. He said it plainly. "Some people can do that. It is not a small thing." Otis Fenwick wrote back within 10 days, a careful letter, 2 pages, describing 3 years of accumulated, reject hickory from selectively logged second-growth stands on the western portion of his property. His arrangement with the Upper Sandusky Mill had been informal and had effectively ended when the mill upgraded its blade system in 1887. He included rough dimensions of his accessible stock and a description of the logging pattern that had produced it. She wrote back with her standard terms, a delivery schedule, and one additional offer she had not included in the Virgil Pruett arrangement. She would come to the property once before the first delivery to assess the material directly, at no cost to Fenwick. She had learned from the first batch of a new supplier that assumptions about material quality were the point at which arrangements could fail. Not dishonesty, but the natural gap between how a wood lot owner described his timber and what the timber was. The visit to Wyandotte County happened on a Wednesday in early December, a 2-hour drive northeast on roads hardened by the first sustained freeze of the season. Otis Fenwick was 40, lean, deliberate in his movements. He showed her the woodlot without preamble, having done some sorting in advance, pulling the most clearly usable sections to the lot's accessible edge. She spent 3 hours in the lot. The material was good, comparable to the Crestwood pile's better sections, with a higher proportion of usable length hickory than she'd found in the initial Pruett deliveries. She identified in the first hour enough material for approximately 3 months of her current production volume. She also found in the lot's interior a stand of mature Osage orange that Fenwick had been felling for fence post material. The logs were small in diameter. Osage orange rarely ran large, but the grain was the dense interlock character she'd read about, the specific structure that made the species almost impossible to split with a blade running in one direction but extremely stable under the lateral stress that a mallet or maul handle absorbed in use. These fence post cuts. Her voice carried the flatness of a question being asked sideways. What are you doing with the tops? Fenwick looked at the Osage orange stack. Burning mostly. Too crooked for posts. Too hard on the saw for lumber. I'd like to include them in the arrangement. He looked at her. The Osage orange tops were genuinely nuisance material. At what price? Disposal fee. Same as the hickory per load weight. He agreed immediately with the expression of a man who has just been paid to remove a problem he'd been living with. The Wyandotte County arrangement came online in January 1890, adding a reliable stream of hickory and, in smaller quantities, Osage orange to her supply. The Osage orange required entirely different processing, denser, requiring slower saw speeds, generating heat at the blade she hadn't encountered with lighter species, and she spent 2 weeks developing a modified protocol before she was confident in it. The finished handles were extraordinary in the way that materials working against expectations sometimes produce extraordinary results. Dense, smooth, under the spoke shave, carrying a natural golden-green cast in the grain that darkened with oil to something close to amber. She sent 3 Osage orange mallet handles to the timber framing contact she'd developed through Columbus by post with a provenance card and a note describing the species, its properties, and the processing protocol. The response came back in 10 days. The timber framer wanted 12 more, would pay $2 per handle, and wanted to show them to 2 colleagues he believed would be interested in placing their own orders. $2 per handle. Her production cost on Osage orange, accounting for the slower processing time and higher tool wear, was approximately 42 cents. She wrote that margin in the notebook with the specific care she reserved for numbers that changed the shape of what she was planning. Spring of 1890 arrived with 3 regular supply sources, 5 employees including Edmund, and a product line that had expanded from the original 2 handle types to 11 distinct specifications. The hook board in the equipment shed had been extended twice, now running the full length of the north wall. The kiln had been rebuilt over the winter with a larger chest and an improved vent system, incorporating everything she'd learned from 4 years of operation. It was in the weeks just before the Ohio A&M conference, on a Saturday afternoon in late January, that Garland Crestwood walked into the equipment shed alone. Willa was at the draw knife bench working on a white oak adze handle, the spoke shave moving in long, careful strokes. She heard the door but did not look up. Edmund came in and out throughout the day, and her concentration was on a section of grain near the throat that wanted to run out if she wasn't precise. Then she registered the particular quality of the footsteps, not Edmund's quick stride, her father's deliberate pace, the one she'd known since childhood. She set the spoke shave down and turned. Garland stood in the center of the shed looking at it the way a man looks at something he has been adjacent to for years without ever truly seeing. His gaze moved slowly, the sorted blanks on the rack, organized by species and length, the rebuilt kiln in the corner, its stovepipe going straight up through the roof, the vent system she'd fabricated from salvaged brass fittings, the hook board along the full north wall, 60-odd handles hanging in rows, each one with its small printed card attached on a length of twine, the packing table near the rear door with its stack of addressed boxes, and the postal scale she'd acquired in the fall. Martha Gould at the finishing bench, her back to the door, working with the focused quiet that characterized everything she did. He walked along the wall of finished handles, slowly, looking at each one without touching, the way you look at something you are trying to fully understand before you say anything about it. Then he reached up and took one down, a full-length axe handle near the middle of the row, a piece from the 3rd Pruett delivery, straight-grained with a subtle density that showed in the weight. He turned it in both hands. He ran his thumb along the full length of the grip section, feeling the oval transition and the slight swell at the base. He held it at arm's length and looked down its axis. He pressed his palm against the shoulder and applied light torque, feeling what the grain did under the load. He set it back on its peg carefully. His hand stayed on it for a moment, two fingers resting on the oiled surface. "You were right." His voice was quiet, carrying no performance. Willa looked at him from across the bench. "About which part?" "About the wood." A pause. "About the market." "About all of it." He looked at the handle still under his fingers, then at the row of them stretching along the wall. "About what this was." Martha Gould had stilled at her bench, not turning, giving the moment its privacy without leaving. "Thank you," Willa said, and meant it simply. Garland looked at his daughter for a moment, with the expression a man who has covered considerable distance to arrive at a position he could have been standing in an earlier, and who is choosing not to waste time on the distance now that he is here. "What do you need?" She did not hesitate. She had known the answer to this question since before she'd had permission to ask it. She needed the full shed, not just the back two-thirds. She needed the space where he currently staged equipment for the spring planting season moved to the smaller outbuilding. She needed a budget for a belt sander and a second band saw. The current machine was approaching the end of a productive blade cycle, and she didn't want to be running a single point of failure when she had orders outstanding. She needed him to renew the conversation with Virgil Pruett about whether the mill would consider adding a second bi-weekly delivery during the peak months of fall and winter when retailers built tool inventory. Garland listened to all of it. He nodded once at the equipment staging question, which meant that was already resolved in his mind. Twice at the Pruett conversation, which meant he was already calculating when to go. "You decide what you need," he said. "We'll figure out money." He looked around the shed one more time, at the kiln, at the blanks on the rack, at the wall of finished handles with their cards, and then he walked out. The door closed. Martha Gould resumed her work at the finishing bench as though the silence had never happened. Willa stood at the draw-knife bench for a moment, her hand resting on the half-finished adze handle. Outside, she heard her father's boots crossing the yard toward the house, steady and unhurried. She picked up the spoke shave and went back to work. The Ohio A&M conference invitation had arrived in late January, a letter from Professor Cordelia Vane in her characteristic angular hand, 2 pages direct about what she was proposing, a presentation at the college's Applied Materials Conference in February, the audience being faculty, students, extension agents, and several journalists from Columbus who had expressed interest in the event's themes. Vane described it plainly. Willa's operation was the most successful documented case of applied materials science, producing a viable commercial enterprise in Ohio in the past decade, and the conference needed to stop filling its program with theoretical work, while ignoring the people actually applying the theory. Willa wrote back accepting. She spent 3 evenings preparing her remarks, not from a written text, but from the structure she'd used since the Grange meeting. Numbers first, argument second, implications third. She would bring the first notebook. She had decided this before she'd finished accepting the invitation. The conference was held on a Friday in February 1890, in the college's main lecture hall, a room she had sat in as a student, in which the perspective from the podium was entirely different from the perspective from the third row. 90 people occupied a room sized for 120. Professor Vane sat in the front row, her expression carrying the quality of someone who has waited a long time for a particular conversation to be had in a particular room. Willa Crestwood sat in the third row. He had not told Willa he was coming. She had mentioned the conference at the kitchen table the week before, in the offhand way of someone reporting a scheduled obligation, and he had listened without comment. He had driven 47 miles on a February morning in the dark wool suit he reserved for occasions that required his understanding of what the occasion meant. The suit he wore for weddings, for funerals, for the moments that asked him to register, in fabric, that what was happening mattered. She saw him when she walked to the podium. She had been focused on the mechanics of the moment. The notebook under her arm. The arrangement of reference points. She'd organized the particular stillness required before speaking to a room that was mostly quiet and waiting. She saw him and stopped for a fraction of a second that no one else would have noticed. He was wearing the suit. She went to the podium. She spoke for 40 minutes. She covered the material accurately, the market analysis, the supply chain, the technical protocols, the financial performance from $461 net in 1886 to $3,720 in 1889, the evolution of the product line from 2 handle types to 11 distinct specifications. She spoke without apology, without inflation, without the hedging that turns factual statements into opinions. Near the end, she held up the first notebook, the worn green cover, the pages dense with 2 years of accumulated preparation before a single blank had been cut. She said that everything necessary to build the operation had been in that notebook before she could cut the first blank, that the hardest part of the work had not been the knowledge, or the capital, or the technical challenges. The hardest part had been standing in rooms full of people whose certainty ran ahead of their evidence and holding on to what the notebooks said until the evidence arrived to confirm it. The room was quiet for 2 seconds after she finished, the particular silence of people recalibrating something, and then it began. Garland Crestwood stood up before the applause reached him. Not with it, before it, rising from the third-row seat in the dark wool suit, while the room was still in the transition between silence and sound. He stood with his hands at his sides, not yet clapping, looking at his daughter at the podium. Willa looked at him. In the precise gap between the silence and the sound, she looked at her father standing in the third row in the suit he wore for occasions that mattered, and she held that for exactly as long as it lasted. Then the room came forward and the moment moved on. Prof. Vane sat in the front row with her hands in her lap, looking at Willa, and her expression had the quality of something completed, not pride exactly, which implies a hierarchy the expression didn't contain, but the satisfaction of someone who has spent a career saying that a particular thing was possible and has now watched it be made visible in a room she had arranged for exactly that purpose. The journalist from the Columbus Dispatch wrote for 20 minutes after the session ended. He asked 4 questions, all specific, none requiring Willa to explain why the work mattered. His piece appeared in the Thursday edition, quoting her number accurately, which was what mattered to the readers she cared about reaching. 2 letters arrived in the following 3 weeks. One from an extension agent in Knox County, asking whether she would consult on a similar materials analysis for a client with a different species and application, one from a handle maker in Kentucky. One of the 2 she had corresponded with as a student, acknowledging the dispatch piece and asking whether she'd be open to discussing a wholesale arrangement for figured Hickory blank, finding impossible to source in sufficient quality from his local supplier. She replied to both. She filed the dispatch piece in the cedar box, where her mother kept the farm accounts. She did not frame it. The kitchen table conversation happened in April, on a Sunday evening after supper, with the particular quality of spring light that Ohio sometimes produced when the weather had finally committed to a decision, the full, unreserved warmth of a season that had arrived and knew it. Edmund had been working in the shed 4 mornings a week for 4 years. He had learned every step of the operation, blank cutting, kiln loading, handle shaping, quality checkpoint, finishing, packing, and had become specifically skilled at the lathe work the specialty handles required, his precision on the turn geometries exceeding Willa's in specific categories where patience with the tool mattered more than accumulated knowledge of the material. He had also been reading. She had known he was reading because the Knox County Sawmill letter, which she had left on the kitchen table while drafting her reply, had been moved and returned with a small pencil mark in the margin beside the paragraph about mixed hardwood processing. She had not said anything. She had waited. He brought an engineering notebook to the kitchen table on that Sunday evening, brown cover, graph paper, the precision he'd developed on the lathe, visible in the measured diagrams on the first pages. He placed it in the center of the table with the directness of someone who had been practicing the placement. Garland and Bess were at the table. Willa came in from the shed at the sound of Edmund's boot on the porch and sat down at the corner, giving the table the arrangement that had worked best in this kitchen for difficult conversations. Not face-to-face but angled, where responses could come sideways without the pressure of direct confrontation. Edmund opened the notebook to a marked page. He had been reading about the market for specialty handles in the timber framing and log building trades, specifically the demand for species other than hickory, white oak, which they were already processing in small quantities, Osage orange, which the Fenwick arrangement had introduced, and black locust, which he had identified through 2 weeks of letters to sawmills in the central Ohio counties as being present in reject streams at 3 separate operations within a day's drive of Kenton. He had priced the specialty handles he believed these species could produce. He had identified 4 potential buyers in the timber framing community, building from the contact Willa had developed through Columbus. 2 in Ohio, 1 in Pennsylvania, 1 in Indiana. He had projected revenue from a first-year expansion at $4,500 to $7,200. With margins higher than the current Hickory line because the customers were specialists who paid for specification. He had calculated the additional supply cost, the additional processing time, the equipment needs. He presented it all without apology, in the focused monotone of a young man who has checked his numbers twice and is more afraid of the uncertainty in the room than of the numbers themselves. Bess stopped stirring her coffee. Garland set down the water glass he'd been holding. Willa looked at the notebook with the particular attention she reserved for numbers she was taking seriously. Not scanning, reading, which was a different thing and looked different from outside. She read for 4 minutes. She turned to the projection page. She checked his yield estimates against her own experience with white oak and Osage orange, the one area where she had data he hadn't fully accounted for. The numbers were conservative in the right places. He had not overestimated the Osage orange yield, which many people did because the logs looked denser than they processed. He had slightly underestimated the black locust processing time, but only slightly, and the margin was wide enough to absorb it. She looked at her brother across the notebook. He was 22 years old. He had the notebook open between them and his hands flat on the table, and the expression of someone who has built an argument as carefully as he knows how, and is now in the room where it will be tested. Yes, her voice was level, carrying no hesitation, the word arriving without preface or qualification. Not a provisional yes. Not a subject to review yes. The kind that came from reading the numbers of someone who had done the reading. She turned back to the projection page. The black locust processing time is probably closer to 40% longer than you've estimated, not 20. Adjust that column and recheck the margin. Edmund reached into his coat pocket for a pencil. He made the correction in the margin of the projection page, recalculated the bottom line, looked up. The margin still held. Garland had been watching both of them through this exchange. He had the expression of a man watching a conversation he has some distance to fully understand. Not the distance of ignorance, but the distance of arriving at a comprehension that his years in the corn and soybean groove had not prepared him for. He had watched his daughter stand at a podium in February in a suit he had driven 47 miles to sit for. He had watched her operation grow from a corner of an equipment shed to a 5-person enterprise with supply arrangements in 2 counties and customers in 4 states. He had read the numbers in the notebook he had taken from the shed shelf on an October night when his corn had failed, and the numbers had changed something in him that could not be easily named, but that had been changing since December 1885. Willa had not looked at him yet. She was working through a supplier logistics question on Edmund's page 4, checking the road distances from the 3 black locust sources he'd identified. But she said, without looking up, with the quiet certainty of someone stating a fact that does not require emphasis, "It's a good plan, Dad." Garland Crestwood looked at his daughter, bent over his son's notebook. He looked at his son, who was watching his sister read with the expression of a young man who has just found out that the thing he spent 2 months preparing was worth preparing. He looked at the notebook, the brown cover, the graph paper, the pencil-corrected margin. "I know it is." The kitchen was quiet in the way of rooms where something has shifted its weight. Ashford Handle Works is still operating from the equipment shed on the Crestwood farm in Hardin County, Ohio. The first green notebook remains on the shelf above the draw knife bench next to the hygrometer, and the protocol document Willa rewrote in the dark of a December night in 1885 after the second batch failed and the $50 envelope arrived from a coat pocket that had been holding it for a year. The page edges have yellowed. The cover has gone soft with handling. It is still there. The log pile in the back pasture was worked through completely in the spring of 1889, the ground where it had stood returning to grass slowly, still carrying the particular density of soil that has been shaded and compressed for 13 years. What replaced it is not visible from the county road. A set of written supply arrangements, a delivery schedule pinned to the shed wall, a relationship with Virgil Pruitt that has been renewed twice and now includes white oak sections the mill had previously been burning as yard waste. The handles are still made by hand. The provenance cards still cost 3 cents each. The hygrometer is still calibrated to the protocol written in the first notebook, in the compressed handwriting of a 23-year-old woman who hadn't done the arithmetic and was waiting for the evidence to catch up with it. Reuben Thatch came to the shed once more, in the fall of 1891, without specific business, without his nephew's name entering the conversation. He stood in the center of the shed for a while, looking at Martha Gould's hands moving over a hatchet handle at the finishing bench, at the row upon row of finished handles on the north wall with their small cards attached, each one carrying the information that made the object legible to someone who hadn't watched it made. He took a mallet handle from the rack, an Osage orange piece from the last Fenwick delivery, dense, the grain nearly gold in the shed's lantern light. He turned it in his hands, held it by the working end, and pressed his palm against the head face, feeling the weight distribution. Set it back with the care of someone who has just understood something about what a well-made object is. Edmund was at the lathe, adjusting the tool rest for a new turning. Thatch looked at him with the expression of a man who has something to say that he has had to work for the right to say. "Your sister was right." His voice carried the directness of someone who has learned that delay does not improve this kind of statement. About the ash, about the market, about all of it. Edmund did not stop adjusting the tool rest. His voice was even, not dismissive, not unkind. She's been right about most things. I've seen her look at carefully. Thatch stood for another moment. He looked at the empty space along the south wall, where the original log pile's material had entered the shed and been transformed into what now hung on the north wall. He looked at the hookboard, handle after handle with their small cards, each one a piece of wood that had been a disposal problem and was now a thing someone would pick up and turn in their hands and pay for and use and keep. Then he said goodbye and walked out to the county road. The shed continued. The bandsaw ran. The kiln hummed at its calibrated temperature. The work went on, as it had gone on since 5 in the morning on a September day in 1885, when a 23-year-old woman had lit a lantern in an empty shed, gone out to a log pile with a cant hook and begun.